Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Today, of course, though, we are absolutely delighted to have Thomas Page McBee with his second book, Auteur. Wonderful. Yeah, okay. And he'll be in conversation with Anne Friedman. And if you wanted to draw a pie chart of who wore it best between me and Anne Friedman, 50% would say we admire each other's glamour and strong sense of personal style, and 50% would say shine theory. Shine theory is when you meet a woman who is intimidatingly witty, stylish, beautiful, and professionally accomplished. Befriend her. And Anne Friedman invented shine theory, among other accomplishments. You're sure to be charmed by her. But Thomas Page McBee is widely published in the New York Times just recently, Playboy, Glamour, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. His work has been named Best Book of the Year by NPR, BuzzFeed, Kirkus Reviews, and Publisher Weekly. Auteur has been so widely praised. It's really, really, really gotten an incredible reception. It has been called a warm hug, an invitation, brutally honest, a confrontation, enormous, beautiful, slim, tough, hopeful, concise, fierce and delicate, urgent, generous, and fearless. Let's please give them a warm round of applause.
Wow, thanks for coming out on a Saturday of Labor Day weekend. I'm so flattered that you're all here. That was an amazing introduction. I think, maybe the best I've ever gotten. So we're off to a good start. I've been convinced to read a little bit from the book, so I'm just going to read the very literally first 2 pages, and then we're going to get to talking. And I'm reading Anne's copy because I didn't bring my copy. November 2015. According to the laws of physics and USA boxing, this wasn't a fair fight. But there we were, 2 guys past our primes, circling each other in front of 1,700 drunk onlookers in Madison Square Garden, that hallowed hall of American boxing. Since July, I'd bled at the gums and screamed into pillows and almost quit. I'd failed. I temporarily, and to varying degrees, lost my mind, my hearing, and my friends. Also, the guy with the 17 pounds on me could beat bruises across my face. Both of us a messy mosaic of blurred senses, damp armpits, hot lights, tangy throat, rubber mouthguard bite marks, squeaky pivots, spangles of stars. Also that my fists could connect with his stomach and his mine. It would hurt, the stinging price of knowing my body's upper limits. But for now, my muscles harmonized out their combinations as a meditative quiet sucked the cheers out of the stadium. I understood that we were both just sinew and blood and bone and follicles and decay. The truth was, I loved him, even as I danced around him with my hands in the air. I was a new man, the first transgender man to fight in the most storied boxing venue on earth, there to close the gap between us, like the fiction that it is.
Ugh. I have like a full goosebump. So I just want to start by asking, why boxing? Like, tell me the appeal, not just like how the idea began, but like what the appeal was.
Yeah. I've always been a big fan of boxing, which is weird because I'm not really a big fan of violence, but if anyone here is a boxing fan, maybe you can relate. I just feel like as a sport, there's something so vulnerable and exposing about watching a fight. Like if you watch boxing, you can see almost immediately what people's weaknesses are and what their strengths are, and it is very much like the literary trope of like man versus man. You know, you're in the ring, and it's like you really see like everything that is about that person, you know, exposed. So something about that, I find it very touching. So that's why boxing, kind of broadly. But very specifically in the book, you know, I had this encounter with this guy in 2015 who tried to street fight me. I don't know how many people here have ever been in a situation where someone's tried to street fight you. It's pretty weird. If you're just going about having your normal day, going to the bodega, getting ice cream, and then somebody's like screaming at you on the street. And at that point in my life, there was this summer where it was like 3 times this happened to me, and this was the 3rd time. And in retrospect, my mom had just died, and I was like probably walking around pretty angry and like carrying a lot of like weird animal rage or whatever. And this guy just picked up on it or whatever. But I felt like I was just at a limit with like that kind of bullshit since my transition. It was 4 years in. There had been a million things that had happened, and this was like the last straw where I was like, okay, I almost got into a fight with this guy for no reason. And then I thought, I'm either going to become this guy or I need to like change my life. And so that's where the boxing sort of started, was me being like, okay, why does this even happen in the first place? And then I trained to fight. It all adds up, really, if you think about it.
And so like I want you to talk a little bit more about that period in time, because I also loved your first book, which also features as a pivotal moment, you having like a violent altercation with someone on the street. And so like when I read that, I was like, is this just going to keep happening to you? Like,
God,
are you processing? You know, it's just like, it seems like there's been something about like that type of interaction with a stranger that has led to a few different big shifts for you.
Wow, Anne, that's so deep. I
What?
feel like you and my
I'm a
therapist
fan
should
of
talk.
your work.
No, I mean, that's like really true. It's like both books started because like guys attacked me in the street. You're right. And maybe it says something that like, to me, I think I associated men with violence so deeply that both of those things seemed like, well, that's just what happens on some level, you know? The first book is, the first book is about like this moment where I get mugged at gunpoint by a guy who goes on to shoot two other men in similar muggings, and one of the other men dies. And at the time I was mugged, I hadn't transitioned, and I spoke, and when I spoke, he let me go. So in my mind, and I think the sort of general theory was that like he let me go because I wasn't yet male. And this book starts also with a guy trying to hurt me in some sort of way. It's true, and I think the theme is that I have, I didn't transition until I was 30. I had a lot of anxieties and fears about men, and they were stemmed in the idea of violence. And I think in the first book, it was sort of, I was exploring, like, how do I become a man even though I'm so afraid of men? And I think in the second book, I was thinking a lot about, like, okay, I am a man, and actually a lot of the things that I was worried about in terms of, like, what it is to be a man in the world, those things were true. Like, they weren't wrong. Like, I was experiencing my masculinity in ways that were like problematic as well as beautiful. And so this book is more about like, okay, how do I not become the man who fights somebody back in the street, And so that's, they are speaking to each other, I guess, in that way.
Yeah, totally. And I think that I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, you mentioned that you were 4 years into your transition when this second kind of, I'm sure you've had other powerful interactions on the street, but the interaction that led to you wanting to learn how to box, when that happened, and you kind of mentioned like there were some things that you had noticed about yourself as a man that you maybe didn't love, or like were trying to work on how to address. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that. Like, what are some things you had noticed and hadn't noticed until you got into the ring?
Yeah. So when I transitioned, I was 30, and I was working as a journalist at the Boston Phoenix. So I was paying a lot of attention to the masculinity crisis, which was like, actually, that language has been around for a long time in sociology
Decades, right?
circles. Yeah, but only pretty recently have we been talking about it in like popular circles. So I think I was really fixated on a sort of in a poetic way on that phrase of the masculinity crisis, because I felt like I was in crisis. I felt like my masculinity was in crisis even from the very beginning, and it was very. I started testosterone, and for me, it was like almost immediately there were effects, and so I could chart very quickly like how my life was different. Which was really overwhelming because obviously so many things were going on personally, but then to be walking around in the world, it's like I would leave my house and I would notice, for example, that like if I was walking on the street at night, first of all, I could walk on the street at night and not feel scared. Second of all, I was scary to other people. Like if there was a woman on the street, she might cross the street to not be on the same side as me if it was dark, for example, or move out of the car in the subway I'm in if I'm the only person in it. And so those sorts of things were alarming, and I got the messages about like what my body meant in space and how it was different pretty quickly. And also, like I felt I was very aware that I was being touched a lot less. Like I wasn't being hugged as much by my friends, or if I met somebody new, they always shook my hand first, Or my uncle actually literally said to me, "I will only shake your hand now because you're a man," and he meant it as a compliment. But that was weird.
And in real time, did that feel sad to you? Or like, was it only later that you kind of thought about it?
It felt sad to me in real time, and also it felt like he was at the time, like a 75-year-old man who was trying to show me that he respected me. So it felt bittersweet, but also sad. And those things I kept filing them away. And then on the flip side, like the privileges of being a man were really apparent to me. The New York Times essay that was referred to in the introduction was about, in the first 6 months at a new job, and when I was in my transition, it was very early on, and my voice changed, and when I spoke, I noticed that people just got silent. And as any woman in the room knows, like when you speak in a work meeting, it is not true that people get silent ever, and I was used to coming at it from like having sort of screw up my courage and figure out how to talk and figure out the internal politics of a situation and who can I like speak to and speak over and all of that, and it was just like magic. Suddenly I spoke, and even though I was harder to hear, people were listening to me, and so I was clocking all of those things and feeling like I'm happy to be a man. I'm obviously really happy to be in my body. That's why I'm doing this. It's like it's a real process, but I didn't want my masculinity or the way I was in the world to be at the expense of my sort of integrity, and I felt like it was. I felt like I was in a new, there was body dysphoria, but then I was now in a situation where I was in moral dysphoria in terms of being a person, and that's what the book came out of, was me wanting to explore that,
Mm-hmm. I'm just sitting with the term moral dysphoria right now. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your decision-making process of after you found a gym where you wanted to train, how you decided what of yourself to reveal to the people who were training you and training with you, and how you made some of those choices, because I found those parts of the books some of the most interesting.
Yeah. So I am a trans person who, if you Google me, you know I'm trans. It was sort of early on. I really was very public about disclosing my trans status, and also I never therefore have had experiences where people, besides in passing on the street or whatever, where people didn't know I was trans. And so in this boxing was actually initially an article I was writing, and I wanted to write about white collar boxing gyms and how these why people who don't have to risk anything would choose to risk themselves in this exact situation. So I made a conscious choice that was complicated to not tell the people I was training with that I was trans. And part of that was I wanted to make sure that the way I was being treated was really reflective of there was nothing about the way I was treated that had to do with me being trans. I really wanted to understand this sort of very socialized, homosocial, masculine space without it being mediated in any way. But that was complicated for me because I spent a lot of time thinking about passing and what it means, and it was really interesting. I feel like at the end of it, to be totally honest, I don't even think this is in the book, but I think I came out of it feeling yeah, I am a trans man. That modifier needs to be in front of my identity. It actually is really important to me. And I don't know if I would have known that if I hadn't sort of spent months and months without that being at the forefront of my mind.
Right. Yeah, and I think that so much of this book, I mean, maybe I also read this as a journalist, but so much of it I can see your reporting instincts coming out. Particularly some passages you do this amazing fact check on what does testosterone really do to a body, and what do we know can be attributed to it? And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that, because that was a real education for me.
Oh yeah, and that's my favorite fact.
Is it?
Book. Yeah.
I totally dog-eared that page. It's my favorite fact in this book too.
Because it was the most scary the whole idea of the book is like the Zen concept of beginner's mind. So in that koan, it's like something like in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, and in the expert's mind there are a few. So what I tried to do is I asked like every like stupid or like basic question I had about masculinity, because I think the problem with masculinity is you're not supposed to question it at all. Like especially if you're trans or if your masculinity is fragile in some way, you're supposed to just sort of accept it and then disappear into the night and like just thank God that people are like seeing you for who you are or whatever. So my biggest one was like, does testosterone make you aggressive? And related to the street fighting and related to the guy who tried to kill me and then related to like my own childhood and my abusive dad, like it's like I'd gone through this whole process because I was a man and I needed to, but I also felt very scared that the end of the line, and this is just my own stuff, but I was very worried that the end of the line, the big answer would be, yes, testosterone makes you into a violent person, and that's just what it does. And so I really tried to face that fear by doing a lot of hard reporting about what testosterone actually does. And I talked to Robert Sapolsky, who's a Stanford neuroscientist. He's a famed neuroscientist. He like lived with baboons for a year. He's a really interesting guy.
Just like him and the baboons?
Yeah, he wrote a book about it. Yeah, so he knows like if you want to do your evolutionary biology fact checking, like he's like a guy you can definitely hold up against an evolutionary biologist and be like, this guy knows monkeys, you know. But his thing was like, the thing about testosterone is that it doesn't cause aggression. What it does cause is status seeking. So. And in 99% of cultures, we reward status seeking with aggression. But they've done economic studies, like economic games, where in order to win the game, you have to cooperate. And in those games, men with the highest testosterone levels are the most cooperative. However, in those same games, if you give men a placebo and tell them it's testosterone, they act like assholes. And they're really aggressive. So to me, it's like that idea that, of course we're organisms and we're responding to the environments around us, but just to, there's so often, especially around trans issues, like there's this sort of, people have this like kind of desire to be like nature versus nurture and the nature of it all. And I think, first of all, nature and nurture can't be separated. Why are we even doing that thought experiment? That's a side note.
Third book.
Yeah. Like, in what reality is there nature without nurture or nurture without nature? It's like, it's just such a strange way of thinking. But anyway, but also like, I think that idea that testosterone is somehow this elixir that creates all of this behavior that then justifies things that are really terrible that happen in the world. It's just not true. And I think that to me, that was a huge relief, but also it made me pretty angry.
Yeah, I wrote down this quote, like, so there during the time in which you are training, one of the questions you get asked by the other guys, and they are predominantly guys at this gym, is, you got to fight? Like, are you training for a fight?
Yeah.
And I would love to hear you talk about like what that question meant and why it was important, because I think it gets to this idea of like, are you a real boxer?
Yeah, right.
Are you real here, or are you just playing? I don't know.
Well, and I was really interested in that idea of like real men too, which I think was which came up a lot in this context. Like, what is a real man, right? It's a moving target. Like, there's not actually a way to be it, yet we all act like we know what it means. And then if you're not a real man, you can easily be pointed to as not being a real man, but then if you try to ask someone like, what is a real man, they can't answer you. But in the fighting context, like, there wasn't so much that, but there was like, are you a real boxer? And so there were plenty of people for various reasons who were like training, for exercise or whatever and there's like interesting economics around how these boxing gyms work and class and et cetera. So plenty of people were coming in and they were doing their like class pass, like, exercising, and then there were like the people who were like training for the Golden Gloves or training for whatever, and those people were given like this kind of credence. I very much felt like I was not a real boxer because I was bad at it and because I, was like doing a charity fight and was a reporter, but it didn't matter to the guys I was training with, and it was interesting because it was like, that was the bar, nothing else, like, not if I was good, not if I was real, but just like, was I training for an actual fight? And it was sort of an interesting thing because I felt like, in a way, I felt like that bar seemed kind of fair, like, because that putting yourself at risk is what they were interested in. Are you willing to actually do this, or are you just here for fun?
Do you feel like that translates to the "Are you a real man?" question? Like, are you putting yourself at risk? Like, in a not in a way it's maybe commonly defined, but maybe how you would be thinking about those terms now.
Yeah. I don't know, because I think this is where boxing became interesting, because the intimacies of boxing were different than what I expected. And one thing I thought would be true would be that the boxers there would be really, the fighters would be really interested in how good you were, how tough you were, how aggressive or crazy or whatever you were. Like, I kind of assumed that would be the measure, and there would be machismo around that. But that wasn't true, and this is where I think things got interesting and surprised me. You know, I think in a lot of ways, like, just the desire to do it and the showing up created an intimacy in that gym. And I felt more supported by the men in that gym than I've probably felt supported by, like, any group of people, since my transition. And that was really surprising. So I think, I don't know. I think it was more like, are you willing to really do this, or are you just here to, like, I almost feel like it was actually the opposite. It felt like it was like a filtering mechanism. Like, there were plenty of people there who wanted to, like, have the bragging rights of, like, being at the gym, doing the thing. There were plenty of, like, Wall Street guys, for example, who were trading to who they were there with their clients doing and whatever. And this was like, I think it was like, are you actually trying to do this, or are you just here to show off? And then if you're trying to do it and you aren't great, or you need a lot of help, then there's, like, a lot of people who are going to help you get better. And that was actually pretty moving to me.
Right. During the course of your training, there are a few different things that people in the gym, like, say about you or describe you with, and one of them is, like, he's got balls, and the other one is, he's got heart. I would love to hear you talk about that, and also maybe how, like those things are so literal, and you do some great, like, work with those phrases in the book, but talking about a little bit about the physicality part of it, and, like, all this big picture masculinity stuff that's going through your head, and how those things tie together.
Yeah, it was true that, like, doing this it worked in the sense, doing this project worked because every single vulnerability I had felt very exposed, like, literally. And again, back to, like, that's what boxing is. Like, you are exposed in your weaknesses, and then not just exposed in them, but you have to turn them into strengths. Like, and that's kind of the cool part about the sport. And, like, a big weakness or vulnerability I had was, like, feeling, like, very conscious that literally when I was changing in the boxing gym, if anyone were to look too closely, like, I potentially could be maybe in danger, or something could happen to me. And I felt like every day was, like, this sort of, like, that was the bravest thing I did, really, was, like, get naked with these dudes and be like, I hope that nobody is paying attention to what's happening, for me. And so, yeah, I got told I had balls a lot, and I don't have balls. So that was, like, an interesting, thing to, like, kind of think about, but to sort of
everyday metaphor.
Everyday metaphor. Yeah, it was, but it was kind of profound to, like, sort of feel like that. I guess to feel the difference, the distinction between, like, that anxiety I was having, and then constantly being sort of called back to, like, this is, I don't know, even though I don't, people feel like I do. And that sort of felt like the story of my life. And then the heart thing was, like, powerful because that was, like, it's the sweetest compliment in boxing. And it's actually, I think my sense is, like, it's sort of the biggest compliment. It's like, this is the catch-all thing you say about someone when you're saying, like, they are capable of something, even if, I don't know, they're capable of something and they are passionate and they can do it, even if they can't do it in the moment, like, I believe in them, and that, I got that compliment sometimes too, and that was really beautiful to me. And I guess it does feel like the sort of tough and tender two sides of, like, of thinking about masculinity. Like, both of those things are, I guess, I don't want to say they're important, but they were both important to the people I was around.
Right.
And it was interesting to be like, to have people point to me about having both of those qualities.
Yeah, I know. I love the contrast.
Yeah.
So this book prompted me to go to the dictionary, as I often do, and, like, be like, what is the, like, Merriam-Webster definition of masculinity? And it's one of those dictionary definitions that's just, like, circular. It's like qualities associated with men, which to me says, like, ugh, that's so annoying. Also, that there is a great opportunity there, which is to say that everyone who identifies with that label has an opportunity to kind of say, like, this is what we would like to be associated with, that term. And I'm just like, you know, if you could kind of wave a wand or whatever, like have some kind of all-powerful way of dictating, like, okay, like these are the sets of qualities that maybe you now aspire to or try to exhibit or like hope for all of, you know, people who identify with the term man. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, as like the power and burden of shaping that.
Well, so much of what being a man means, according to sociologists, is like this sort of policing about what being a man means. It's like a snake eating its tail.
Right.
And it's interesting because if you think about it, like we're all sort of complicitly agreeing to that, even if we don't overtly agree with it, which is sort of the point of the book. Like, what if you just make that conscious, and then once you make it conscious, then you actually have I think, a moral obligation. Once that's called attention to like start rethinking it and being like, if I'm not comfortable with what being a man means because of how it makes me feel, what if I just stop doing that? Or what if I transgress this in some way and model it? And the cool thing about anything associated with being a man, being a masculinity, which obviously, but like the cool thing about that is that then you can enlarge what being masculinity means by people like behaving in whatever way they feel is the masculinity they want to have. And I think that, you know, like in the book, there's like a description of this experiment that sociologists do with boys. It's really heartbreaking, actually. It's called the man box. And they do it with like 10-year-old boys, and they draw like a box or whatever they don't have overheads anymore, but you know, whatever that is. Whatever people use now to project a computer projection, you know, whatever. They use an iPad and they do a pencil. But they ask like boys, like, you know, what qualities do you associate with being a man? And so boys say things like domination or aggression or, you know, like winning or whatever. And it's like all this stuff that's like a very limited box of stuff, which is the man box. And so that's what goes in there. But then they ask them, like, think about a man you admire, like, you know, your dad or your coach or like somebody in your life that you think is great, and like, you know, what qualities are not in the box that he has. And so then they'll say things that are just like human qualities, like, oh, he's really nice, he's really like there for me, he's like, you know, he is, you know, whatever, he's like loving, he's like affectionate. And so like that, even that discrepancy, it's like children understand the difference between what we tell men to be and what the men we love actually are. So if they understand that, and if they understand that they're still supposed to be in the box, like, we're doing something really wrong. So we need to figure out how to expand that box so that people don't go, well, a real man fits in the box, and then everyone who's transgressing it is just, I don't know, taking a risk, or like having to use the cover of, for example, violence to like boxing to show that they can be intimate, you know, in any other kind of context. So to me, like, I know I'm not answering your question exactly, but I think I really wanted to come through my own transition, be on the other side of it, and say, at the end of the day, I'm still myself, you know? And I felt like it took 7 years to even be able to, like, reconnect with the person I was before my transition in terms of, like, the things I didn't want to lose, because I felt like the culture we live in was just taking those parts away from me, and I didn't want to lose them. And so that was the book. The book was about trying to make sure I came back to myself, and that's my masculinity.
One reason I think this book is so important, and you have a large body of work that does this, is pushing back against the idea of like there being kind of like a trans narrative, like singular. And you know, this book is really about like a long and continuous process of like asking the question of like, what kind of person do I want to be? Like, what kind of identity do I want to inhabit in the world? And I'm curious about, now that you are on the other side of this boxing experience, if there's like a different set of questions that you're like thinking about or plagued by, not to like be too therapy about it, but you know, I'm just kind of curious
totally
about like the next step.
This.
No, my God, no, not licensed. But you know, like I do really appreciate how you kind of show that, like, you know, like life is transition for everyone, like whether or not, you know, like that happens in different ways and in different, you know, relationships to gender for different people, but like truly, like, you know, you're still in an ongoing, evolving relationship with this, I have to imagine, with your gender and with masculinity. So I would love to hear about where you're at now.
Well, so I like had this hope for this book that I would write it and then everyone would realize that they have a gender. And then it would be great because I would talk to people and I would be like, you have a gender, I have a gender, not just trans people, not just women, not just cis women. We all have genders and we're all going to have these conversations. And that's worked to some degree. I actually feel like I am having that conversation more. But I'm still amazed at how often, especially with cis men, there's sort of, and I get it, because if your identity is based in the idea that masculinity is a thing that exists that you aspire to because it's real and you need to be real and therefore you need to like embody this masculinity in a certain way. There can be a way that I think it's a refusal to have empathy for people who are not having that experience or not buying into that way of thinking. And so I guess what I'm thinking a lot about right now is like, how do I, like, I mean, this is just like a super honest answer in a bookstore, but whatever. But like, I've been thinking a lot about like, you know, like media narrative still, because I've been doing media for this book, and I am a reporter, and I understand how we frame stories, and I know immediately if I'm doing an interview and someone says, "So, good to meet you, Thomas. Let's start with, when did you first know that you weren't a girl?" That's that's the first question, and if that's the first question, I know where it's all going, and I know that like it doesn't matter. I wrote a book. We talk, you know, all this stuff's on there. Like it's about gender. We all have a gender. All of that stuff.
Go to Amazon.com or IndieBound.com or walk down the street to a bookstore and purchase.
Please just read the
book I wrote about this.
It's very frustrating, but it makes me realize how just how dedicated people are, I think, still to this idea that like only trans people have genders, you know, or only cis women have genders. And so I'm trying to figure out, one of the questions I'm thinking about a lot is like, how do I, for everyone's sake, figure out, like find a way to reach to people who are feeling that way, even after they engage with this material. Even, you know, if you walk away from it and you think, interesting story about a trans guy, like, I feel like, how do I get you to understand that, like, you actually are part of this culture? And in fact, it would be to your benefit to see that you're, you know, the coolest thing about realizing you have a gender is realizing you can liberate yourself from expectations about gender identity and your kids and your coworkers and your friends. Like, this is literally a system of power. And it's not an innate thing, which is not to say you can't have an identity. I have an identity. You can't not. It's not. It just means that like you have options and choices and freedom about how you want to live your life. And so that's what I'm thinking a lot about. Is like how do I reach that person who engages with this material, but then still says like, you know, that's not really about me, you know? And so, yeah, that's that kind of question.
Yeah.
Other kind of questions I think about, though, are just like, you know, about now that I have this framework, it's really cool. I feel like I can just go into any situation, and instead of like having to perform my competency, I can say like, I have no idea what I'm fucking talking about. People love it. People think it means that I'm so confident that I can say it, but it really just means that I feel more comfortable being like, I literally don't know what's going on most of the time. And
I do think very
helpful.
Confident people admit, like, when
so.
they don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's a hallmark of confidence.
Okay,
truly.
well, great.
Yeah.
I mean, awesome.
Not that you need my affirmation.
No, I mean, I love your affirmation, but I do feel like what I've realized from writing the book is that I can just keep asking questions, and that's like I don't know. I think especially being a man, you're not supposed to have questions. You're supposed to have answers. And it was one thing that I felt really weird about male socialization, and being able to resist that is awesome.
Ugh. Hugs and questions.
Yeah.
That is the perfect segue. If any of you have a question, you can raise your hand and ask it.
I have a question rule, though, I have to tell you.
Oh, great. Please. Set the rules.
I've only had to use it like twice. My question rule is, any question you ask me, I can ask you back. But I will only do that if you ask me a really fucking weird question. No offense. And I'll say, though, one time I did that, and I thought the question was really weird, but actually it was not weird, but I'm glad I asked back. I can tell the story if people care. Okay.
Tell it, and then everyone can think of a question while you tell it. Yeah.
I did this, like, workshop. I don't normally do this, but it was, like, a Trans 101 workshop at this, like, LGBT senior center. And it was really LG Senior Center. And it was like the group of these like seniors who were very sweet, but like kind of like, I don't know if they were like really following along with what I was talking about. And then at the very end, this person raised their hand and they said, do you have a male brain or a female brain? And I was like, and it was like this like record screech, like, and I just was like, oh, I just went through all this stuff and like, that's what and I was super like uncomfortable. But then I remembered my rule, and I remembered that I told them the rule, so I was like, do you have a male brain or a female brain? And they said, well, I thought I had a female brain, But now I'm listening to you talk, and I'm realizing I might have a male brain. And I was like, oh, you think you're trans? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, oh, okay.
Whoa.
Yeah. I personally, I was like, actually, there's no such thing as a male and a female brain. Like, that's not actually. But I hear you, and that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And that's not what I thought you were going for with the question. So.
Listen, language is imperfect.
Yeah,
Imperfect
it is,
instrument.
and that's
Yeah.
why it's good to have that kind of role.
Yeah.
Because maybe I'm wrong, and I'm misunderstanding you.
Right. Ugh.
But anyway, didn't mean to scare you guys. If you have, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm curious, because in the book you work a lot to like sort of have conversations with these guys in the gym, and I'm curious about what it felt like to come out of the gym and write this book that probably won't get read in boxing gyms, like how you felt about sort of writing the thing. But as much as you had talked to these guys while you were there, like was maybe something they weren't going to read about themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, one really cool thing about the book has been that the guys I trained with are big fans of the book. They came to my book party and were like, it was like really great. Like it was like a crew of boxing guys, like just at this like Brooklyn Historical Society book launch, who were just really pleased to be there, and they felt very like important, I think. And my coach has remained my friend, and he's like a huge fan of everything of the book and of like everything I've been doing. So so that was like a cool surprise. I didn't know that would happen. And then the organization that put on the event has been like email blasting people about it and like letting everyone know about the book. So so actually I found a lot of support within that very small world. But yeah, obviously there's like the you know, the people who own the gym, like I don't think they know about the book. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, is your question like what do I feel about them not having read it, or?
I was thinking more largely about the accessibility of conversation. Like we were talking about, like I want these conversations to be happening in boxing gyms everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, how do you do that?
Yeah, how do you do that? Well, you know, actually, I think that the guys that are in the book are great ambassadors. Like, they're still training, and they, like, they're all, like I said, they've been very supportive in a way that I wasn't expecting, to be honest, because I didn't come out to people as trans, so they sort of found out as the book came out, and so it was, like, interesting to see that reaction, and I wasn't sure where that would go, and they've really rallied around me, and you know, part of like why trans visibility, for example, is so important is because most people don't know a trans person or don't know they know a trans person. So having all of these folks who read the book and then, you know, sort of speak to that like within the gym, that's been really cool. But I hear you on the larger level of like, wouldn't it be great if all of these guys like were thinking deeply about their masculinities? And yeah, I don't know. I think what I can do is find, like, I try really hard to create things that are accessible and universal and hope that people will, like, find themselves in it and then pass it on, you know? And I think that's, like, my slice that I can kind of, like, contain without losing my mind. So that's what I tried to do. But I really do hope that some of the people I trained with are having a different conversation about this stuff. And I know from talking to them that they are, which is really cool.
Yeah. They have a gender.
They have a gender, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the cover is by this artist named Xavier Chapani, and he and I worked together on my first book too. And on the column, I'm writing for Condé Nast's Them. He is a trans guy himself, and he's an illustrator and is a fucking genius. I don't know. I'm very lucky that we're friends. And Michelle T actually found him. She was my editor on my first book, and she found him like through the internet, and that's how we ended up with him on the first book. And then I asked that he do this cover, and Scribner was nice enough to like work with me and him on that. And
Here's the cover.
yeah, it's you know, it's like I think that they did the actual art direction with him, but I think, you know, he's a trans guy. He understood like the concept and the idea. So yeah. Oh, was there interesting? I don't know. I actually have no idea. Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't like consulted on that level of detail around it. I know I wanted it to be pink, and like, you know, I know that we wanted to like find some way to like represent like traditional masculine things, but also like I assume that there was something. And people who do visual literacy probably know better than me, but like I'm sure there was something about wanting to like. I don't know. He has other work where he like sort of splinters bodies, And I think that might be a reference to his own gender, so maybe there's something to that.
I'm getting some classical sculpture vibes from this.
Yeah,
too.
I think definitely. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Has my experience changed walking down the street? Yeah. Like, are guys still trying to fight me? Yeah. I think, well, I mean, first of all, guys aren't still trying to fight me. So that was interesting, which I still think about a lot because I'm like, why was that happening, you know? And I do think a lot about my grief and how I was angry and how I felt like I couldn't express the rest of how I was feeling, you know? And I think that was like creating like some sort of, I do think I was carrying around an energy and people were picking up on it. And other angry people, other angry men were trying to fight me because they were like, you're angry, I'm angry. Like, let's just do this thing, you know? Like, so I think that's disappeared. But I also, I think I mean, I was always trying to be very mindful of the stuff I was referring to, like around women and stuff, and just feeling really conscious of like not wanting to be part of a problem or make other people feel uncomfortable. And I think with the book, like I just got to spend a lot more like time and energy thinking about that even more deeply. And there's like a moment in the book where I'm running and there's like a woman I'm running behind, and I realize that like she thinks I'm on her ass in a way that's scary, and it's really upsetting to me. And I have to like slow down and like, you know. And I just sort of realized, like, there's so many things I need to be careful of in this body, and I think I am. I mean, I'm sure I have room to grow, but I think and my body and space is something I'm trying to be really thoughtful about in this new way. And I think having all that time and energy to think about it with the book was a really helpful sort of mindfulness exercise around doing that. So yeah, it's changed. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about like there's this researcher Sarah DiMuccio who like did this great study around like Danish men and how Danish men define. She asked like, you know, what makes a man versus what makes a woman, and the Danes said, well, what makes a man is someone who's not a boy. And in America, men said, well, what makes a man is not being a woman. And kind of everything that's wrong, probably, with our culture can be defined by that. Women, by the way, who are Danish also said what makes a woman is not being a girl. So just being an adult, basically. And, you know, this book was I really wanted it to be a book about America, about the U.S., and you know, I started it before the 2016 election, but I think it felt even more prescient and important to think about how, you know, how this country and white masculinity and how we are in this moment are all, you know, how it's rooted in all of this stuff. And so that was my focus. I have, this book came out in the UK, and my other book also came out in the UK, and it's been interesting having a different conversation. They're not totally unrelated, but certainly it's like a different nuance to the conversation there. And it is getting published somewhere else. I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it yet because I haven't signed anything, but there's like another country that's going to come out in. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes. But yeah, I haven't yet like thought about things more globally, but I think that was definitely like obviously our different cultures have different ways of thinking about gender, and it's really interesting to think about how much, back to like, you know, if you think testosterone makes something some way, like this is all the arguments about how that's not really true, or at the very least it's not very useful, you know, like it's not useful to spend a lot of time thinking about the thing, and who does it benefit, you know, and who does it hurt when like we say, oh, this is just the natural way men are, you know, because we can obviously look at anything in the animal kingdom and say this is natural, and we don't do that. So sorry, side note. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to think more deeply about other places too. Yeah.
Do you see, I assume it was a highly male environment of a boxing gym, as being an institution that spend more time kind of sharpening the line so that man box, or like is it just a very vulnerable place where it all did more work to break that down?
Yeah, it was shockingly not like a man box, actually. And I think that like my understanding, and I talked to like sociologists like as I was reporting the book out, and that was the sort of the theory was like the cover of violence makes room for intimacy, which is sad, but also like therefore I felt like I had way more intimacy with men than I'd ever had outside of my brother, with the guys I was training with, because there was no threat to anyone's masculinity. Like, you're already doing the most masculine thing you can do, So, like, no need to, like, defend it, And so I felt like it was a much more, like, affectionate, much more supportive, much more, like, I'm also, like, with boxing, like, people were always asking me, like, how I felt, and I was in grief, so, like, it was pretty great to be surrounded by people who every day, 5 hours a day, were like, are you eating? Are you, like, how are, you seem a little off today, like, are you sleeping okay? Like, what's going on at home? Like, you seem like you're not feeling so sure of yourself. Like, it was just a level of intense emotional engagement, because you need it for the sport, but I also think probably because people need that period, and it was a way to make sure that, you got it. Yes.
Related to that, like, if it's not a boxing gym, how else do you think people can get that? Like, can find those spaces for themselves?
Yeah. Like men? Or all of us?
And I think that, like, what you said about that, like, the boxing or the violence gave it this cover where it was, like, this safe space, but, like, MS was like, taking a risk part of that, too. So, like, how do we create spaces where people can relate that way?
Yeah. Well, I think there's been like a lot of research around like, creativity comes in spaces where there's like emotional safety, and then emotional safety allows you to take risks. So, so the question was like, if you aren't in a boxing gym, like, how do you find a way to like have that kind of intimacy and risk taking? And I think men have a different set of socialized things to overcome around that, and like sports can be a way to do that. But I think in general, like, to me, what was working about being in that boxing environment was being surrounded by people who were willing to do a lot of like internal work, because you kind of had to, and like show up for each other every day and sort of make space in a safe way for people to like. I mean, the violence was consensual, and in sparring, which is most of the training, you're not really trying to hurt anyone. You're just trying to help them. So like being in this sort of group dynamic where everyone is like trying to help each other, and where they're showing up every day, and it's not about like how perfect you are or how good you are at performing, but like actually about like working collaboratively to get better at something, like, and then looking at yourself and really being like, where am I, where do I need to grow? I think it's like all the stuff that we all know we need, like spiritually, to be better people, but like finding places or people with which you can do that kind of work is really important. I'm actually thinking about Anne, because if you listen to her podcast, Call Your Girlfriend, like there's a lot about like being, which is a great podcast and you should all listen to it if you don't already. But there's so much in your podcast actually that reminds me of that, in the sense that like, it's about friendship, and it's about holding yourselves and each other accountable, and it's about being in groups where like you all do political things together and like have difficult conversations and like think about yourselves, and right? I mean, wouldn't you think that that's
hope so.
Yeah. But that to me doesn't seem that different, in the sense of like I think we need each other, and we need to look at ourselves, and you need both of those things at once, but in a way that doesn't, it's not about policing people, like it's about lifting each other up. Yeah.
This kind of dovetails off of that, but I'm really interested in the last question you answered in the interview process, which was, what are you thinking about now? If I could take a stab at summarizing, it's how do we get cis men to be aware of their own gender, which is something that I have a really hard time with, because when I have these conversations, it usually ends up in a screaming match of some sort, or like a defensive conversation, or me shaming the man. And I imagine you've done some of this work already. So what do the conversations go like for you?
My favorite conversations are Well, I mean, the thing is, like, you have to be willing to relate and to open up. And I actually feel like step one is realizing that for a lot of people who've been systemically divorced from their ability to have empathy by our culture at a young age, like, that's kind of actually a hard ask. Like, and I think that having empathy myself, I'm like, and sort of understanding how culture works, I try really hard to remember that, you know. And I don't think that means you're not accountable for your behavior. I'm just saying, like, that's a bigger hill to climb. But I feel like for me, what's worked best is being in conversations with cis men where they will relate about boyhoods. Like, you know, like I was talking to a guy for a podcast once, and he, you know, we were just talking about like the ways in which you're policed for like how you move through space. And he said to me, I've never even told my wife this. This was on an interview, but he said, I've never even told my wife this, but like I realize when I'm walking around, because I was teased a lot as a boy, I hold myself a certain way because I kind of swish when I walk, like my hips move a certain way. And I, even now as like a 40-year-old man, try to hold my body so that my hips don't move, even though it's my natural way of walking. And he seemed so sad, like when he said that, you know, and I felt like, wow, like I bet he hasn't thought about this at all until this moment. And those sorts of things make me think about how we're in such a different moments, I think, and the level of like kind of just thinking about never having thought about that until you were 40 years old and realizing your entire body is being like in this uncomfortable position just so people won't, you know, call you gay, because it's worse to be gay than to be anything else. In toxic masculinity, like I think that's how I do it when I can. I try to really hold that that's like a really different conversation than my like queer feminist friends and like the things we're talking about, you know. And I don't know if that's a good answer, but I just try to stay in. I try to realize that people are coming at this from different places, and what you don't know. But for me, like, if you are exposed to something and then you still refuse it, I think that's my bar of, like, my empathy extends really far, but then, like, that's why I'm like, okay, if you don't even want to engage, then, you know, we can't have a conversation. But if you're willing to just come forward a little bit, that to me feels like a better start than being like, you know, you're privileged and you don't understand what you're doing, and, you know, that usually makes people defensive, and we can't get very far from there. I think showing that cis men that gender hurts them too, gender expectations hurt them too, even though that I benefit from masculinity, but I also feel like part of why I wrote the book is because I also felt so aware of the stuff I was talking about, like not being touched, you know, that's fucked up. And as young as infancy, there are studies that women, mothers like don't talk to their baby boys as much as their baby girls. So we start gendering so young, in ways that like we just don't know about, we're unconscious of. So I think like starting to make those things conscious, I think, is the beginning of changing the conversation. Yeah.
We have to.
I mean, in boxing, it's physical, right? A lot of touch. Do you think that's like a space where that feels okay for them?
Yeah, because of the cover of Violence. Yeah. And that's what's so crazy. It's like, and I don't know, maybe everyone here is totally like never thought about this, but I was always so like surprised by how often athletes touch each other, you know, like in sports. And and people joke, you know, it's homoerotic, et cetera. I don't think it's homoerotic at all. I think it's actually men want to touch each other, but we tell them not to. So then there's this one space where it's okay because you're like, I don't know, being aggressive in other ways. And it's super sad to me. I actually found it really touching, literally, but like really touching to be in a dynamic where like guys were always hugging me. They were always like, had their arms around me. It was just like the most physical thing. Like, and it felt like, wow, this is probably just what everyone always wants to be doing. But in this particular context, it's safe.
Right. One more. In the. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know yet. I'm really interested in monsters, but I don't know what that means exactly yet.
All right, that was a quickie,
All right.
so go ahead.
I just was wondering, I'm excited for the cis male modeling. Like, it's an exciting, the bigger thought.
Yeah.
I guess I was just curious, like, in your minds, do you have quick tips for, like, I imagine being more touchy-feely, like, as a guy.
Yeah, like what can cis guys do? No, I don't think there's any one thing, but I think that genuinely, I think this process was helpful, and it seems like it's potentially has universal applications of like, you know, thinking really deeply about like where do you feel a dissonance with yourself. Like this is like an inside thing, like, but where in your life are you walking around in the world, and where do you feel in yourself like I'm behaving in a way that doesn't actually feel right? You know, like I'm not happy with this. I don't feel good about it, and that is probably the red flag. That's like you're there, and this of course also works around like race and class and all the other ways that like we live in cultures where we're living in a culture where we've been internalizing things about ourselves and each other that like we didn't choose. It's an education we got about our culture. So if you are a cis man and something is going on and you're like, this is just, I'm uncomfortable, like I think just like sit with that discomfort. We didn't talk about this at all, but like there's this sort of narrative of like good men and bad men that drives me fucking crazy, because I feel like once you have that, like there's no conversation, right? You just aspire to be the good man or pretend like you're being a good man, or anything about you that feels like it doesn't fit into the good man box, you push it away, you know, and that doesn't allow for any change or growth to happen, you know? So there's plenty of things that are probably happening to you literally every day. They were for me and continue to be, where you're like, you know, that just doesn't feel right. I don't like this thing that just happened to me, or that was expected of me, or that I just did in response to this. And instead of it ending there, like it's worth, I think, asking why. Like what was that about? Who expects that from me? Why do they expect that from me? You know? And I think that process is actually it's a spiritual process, but it's also one where I think anybody can offer then like an education to the rest of us. You know, I think we have human, you know, brain power, and we can all work together to change things by just flagging like what's not working, and that's how change actually happens.
Oh my God, the perfect ending. Perfect.
Thank you all for coming.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.